Hello, my name is Ilona Mettiäinnen and I'm visiting researcher at the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland in Finland. I will talk about Arctic viewpoints to the governance of climate-altering approaches. First of all, what is governance? The IPCC defines governance as the full range of means for deciding, managing, implementing, and monitoring policies and measures. This takes place on many geographical scales from local to global, and that's why the concept of multi-level governance is often used in terms of climate change. Governments, scientific community, media, businesses, civil society, NGOs, and so on participate in governance. The tools of governance include rules, regulations, and laws, and international cooperation, but also market instruments, incentives, funding, and support, as well as guidelines and codes of conduct, even unwritten norms. The Arctic as a region can be defined in many ways, and depending on the definition, it's home to approximately 4 to 4.5 million inhabitants, which is a fraction of the global population. About 10 to 20% of Arctic population is indigenous. Images of the Arctic include polar bears, sea ice, and glaciers. And while these are important icons of climate change, the Arctic is also, as mentioned, a home. Also, it can have a special role in terms of climate-altering technologies. Because the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the global average, the impacts of climate change will be seen first in the Arctic, but also what happens in the Arctic will influence what happens globally. Many of the tipping points are located in the Arctic, and for instance, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet would cause several meters sea level rise. Then how are climate-altering approaches governed? There already are several relevant governance frameworks, instruments, and processes. Here's a list of some of them. These have been addressed previously in other webinars in more detail, and I will not go further into these. Also, solar radiation modification was discussed by earlier speakers, but the governance questions related to solar radiation modification wouldn't ideally need at least near global consensus, at least the SAI. Questions on this include how much cooling should there be, who can decide to deploy, and also on the choices of different designs. Also, targeted interventions or Arctic interventions have been described by the previous speakers. By some authors, these are seen as kind of easier to govern than SAI would be. Partly because this would take place relatively locally. It's possible that this would be it would be possible to decide on these based on just like national legislation or only by a few states together. Well, when talking about the Arctic voice on climate-altering approaches, the Arctic Council is very important. It was established in 1996, and it has its roots in the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy from 1991, also known as the Rovaniemi process. It has 8 Arctic states as its permanent members and 6 permanent participants, mainly indigenous peoples of the Arctic, but also a large group of observers, including non-Arctic states. Currently, Iceland has the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. The Arctic has been a region of peace and stability, and the Arctic Council has been an important forum for international discussions between its member states. And climate change has had a crucial role in the work of the Arctic Council. They also have a significant role in providing information about Arctic environmental changes, and there you can see a list of some recent reports about the changes in snow, water, ice, and permafrost in the Arctic, and 3 regional reports from different parts of the Arctic on adaptation options. In recent publications, the Arctic Council has been suggested as taking a role in defining and representing the Arctic voice on climate-altering approaches. However, it doesn't have a stance or role so far in the governance of climate interventions. Also, the number of actors interested in the Arctic is increasing all the time. There's a lot of aims towards the Arctic inner circle, so more countries want to want to be involved. To cite a couple of recent articles, so Corey has said that Arctic countries must not only wake up to challenges that come with the prospect of geoengineering, but must recognize that they have a special responsibility to carry out such investigation. Podansky and Hunt have written, the Arctic Council should serve as an assessment and policy forum since it comprises the actors who have the primary interest in Arctic activities, including the Arctic circumpolar countries and indigenous communities. It's important to guide research on climate-altering approaches by different codes of conduct. Anna-Marie Hubert introduces the Code of Conduct for Research on Climate-Altering Approaches in a recent article. The governance of research into climate-altering approaches can take place by internal or external methods. The internal methods include, for instance, research ethics, codes of conduct, and different methodologies. And external ones include, for instance, funding-related issues. As Hubert writes, research on climate-altering approaches is needed because information on the efficacy, risks, and benefits of geoengineering measures may be necessary in the future to support better informed decision-making. As a couple of examples of the issues raised in the Code of Conduct, I mention two. Firstly, a moratorium on the use of climate-altering approaches until there is an adequate scientific basis on which to justify such activities and appropriate consideration of environmental and other effects. Moreover, climate-altering approaches cannot be promoted as an alternative to mitigation or adaptation. There are also some research ethical guidelines for research, particularly in the Arctic. For instance, the principles for conducting research in the Arctic by the IARPC from 2018 lists 5 principles: being accountable, establishing effective communication, respecting indigenous cultures and knowledge, building and sustaining relationships, and pursuing responsible environmental stewardship. Another recently updated set of principles and guidelines is those by the International Arctic Social Sciences Association. With the 11 points, this is a very comprehensive list, but I will mention 2 of those. Firstly, the researcher should consult with the appropriate regional, local, and/or indigenous authorities regarding the planned research within their territories. And finally, as number 11, research should be beneficial for local communities and their political decision makers through appropriate knowledge sharing. Also, some countries require research permissions before research is conducted in their area. And for instance, in Greenland, it's essential that the research also benefits Greenlanders. Research can also contribute to governance in meaningful ways. For instance, knowledge on the impacts of different climate intervention techniques, different designs are needed for meaningful participation in governance. You can't really make decisions or discuss issues you don't know about. For instance, the Decimos project empowers developing countries by providing knowledge on the impacts of solar radiation management in those countries. There are also some studies on Arctic communities and their views on climate-altering approaches, for instance, from Alaska and Finnish Lapland. These studies have found that there's some concerns on the controllability of climate-altering approaches, and also ethical concerns on the division of pros and cons between the Arctic and possibly some other countries suffering. Co-production of knowledge with local communities may also inform the scientific communities about important research questions that may not have been identified otherwise. All in all, research on climate-altering technologies and also including the community viewpoints is important because, as Gupta and Möller have said, authoritative assessments constitute a source of de facto governance themselves and consequently shape the context for de jure types of governance. And here are a few references. Thank you very much.